Hello and welcome to another episode of Coding with JoeG. It sound very PBS-like back in the day when I grew up. So today we are going to expand on our contact implementation or a contact application and add in some documentation to the API. So yesterday we spent some time cleaning up the API. We finished adding the delete contact, the get contacts, and save contact. And today we are going to look and add documentation to it. A lot of people are probably saying, why bother adding documentation? There's a couple of different reasons why you want to add documentation, especially something like Swagger, because it provides the intent of your API and allows users to be able to see what you're doing with your API. With Swagger, it provides the ability for you to go and put constraints around your data, around your API, as well as gives you a test bed for the API to allow people to play around with it. As an added benefit of it, it generates a set of documentation that other tools can start to read in, so you don't have to do a lot of the wiring up for your API. So there are a couple different tool sets to use. Swagger in the .NET world seems to be the most popular. I know I've been using it for a long time. I haven't used it in a while, especially since it started to get supported by SmartBear, which shouldn't matter. It's still free and open source. So we're going to be learning and figuring this out together. So if you go to swagger.io, you'll get everything you need to know to how you can design it, build out your APIs, test them, etc. Just as a reference, SmartBear is a company that specializes in testings. There's no way, right now, there's no affiliation between SmartBear and myself. I'm just introducing this tool that they help sponsor. So let's go and take a look. I believe we can go straight through and look at Swagger CodeGen, the editor, and the Swagger UI. This will show us what you can do within the Swagger UI. So if we go to live demo, it'll open up a sample app that allows us to see that for our pet, in this fictional example, we have the ability to upload images, the ability to add a new pet, update existing pet, find pets, a lot of the things we have for our contacts application. A couple of things to note, a lot of this comes out of the box. I think actually almost all of it does, even the color coding. You could, of course, customize it what you want. We probably won't go into great detail of that, but just getting started with it. So let's take a look at it. Contributing Swagger for teams. This is if you want to use their hosted version of it. We're going to keep it separate on our machine, and we'll publish it when we get to publishing the documentation. So let's take a look at the docs. And I don't think doesn't seem to be a getting started. So let's go take a look at the open source tools, see if there's a getting started. If not, there's a docs.microsoft article that we can go and take a look at. editor, npm install, contribute. Nope. Let's go take a look at the docs on Microsoft. They have a good example of how you can add it to your web API. So this tells us about the Swagger specification. Essentially, it outputs a series of JSON that can be consumed by a lot of tools like the Swagger UI, etc. It tells it what it's looking for, like you see here, integer types, name, which is a string, is complete, which is a boolean, and the default is false. So let's see how we get started. So it looks like we need the tool swashbuckle for it to work, which exports a Swagger document object. So we want to install this packages. So let's go to our application and install this package. So I'll pull up our NuGet window, search for swashbuckle.asp.NET Core, make sure it's in our web API project, and then click add. That's the equivalent of typing this on the command line. Now we need to configure the middleware. I haven't discussed what middleware is on this yet. We'll talk about that probably in another demo. So let's go here, copy out this. And that was in the configure services, which should be in our startup file. Startup. And then configure services. So what we're doing here is telling that for the Swagger generation, we want us to use this Swagger doc, which is essentially an extension, give our version API. So if we look at IntelliSense, it says specify the version and then the API info. Now the API info is how you generate the documentation. So for this, we don't want to say contacts API, maybe say coding with JoeG contacts API, and then we'll leave it at version 1. The version number is used in case we go and change any of the features. Since we haven't published anything yet, we're good with keeping it as a version 1. Now let's see what's next. We can enable the user interface and enable the Swagger documentation, in this case swagger.json, to tell it to create all that for us. So let's do it outside of the is development, and I didn't copy. So now we're telling Swagger to essentially generate the documentation. This is the URL for it. We can change it to whatever we want. And then the name of the API. So let's just copy this to be consistent. And we'll probably pull this from a resource file in the future. Let's see, what else do we need to do? After presenting, you have to enable static files. which means we have to add this package to our application. Static files are essentially a way for IIS, or the web server within ASP.NET Core, the ability to serve up static files. By default, it does not. So we have to tell it, by default, it doesn't do anything. We have to tell it everything we want it to do. So now that I am adding that, launch the app, navigate to this. Swagger endpoint can be found. Okay, let's go and double check to make sure this works. I'm going to select that text. That package was added. Let's hit play on the API and take a look. Should pop open in a new browser. And since this port is already in there, let's go and take that out. Now, if we did it correctly, we should get the Swagger doc, which we did. See, it says coding with JoeG. It went through, figured out all the valid responses for the contacts tab. It says that there is a post method called contacts. There's really nothing else here that describes it, so we are going to go and add that. But now we got the basic user interface, or we got the basic OpenApi example. So let's take a look at what we need to further get kind of this user interface. Where are we now? We're not going to install a license yet or add more contact information. We can do that. The version and title is good enough for now. So let's go and take this and just run Swagger itself without the JSON file. The JSON file is used more so for user interfaces to figure out what to generate. And that's what this did here. The Swagger UI went out and queried that Swagger JSON, which you see right here, and said, you have 5 endpoints: a get, a post, a get with an ID, a delete with an ID, and a get, and sorry, another get, which we are calling search. And then plus list out all the different schemas. The schemas are equivalent to our models. So if we look at it, it tells us that here we are expecting a contact ID, which is an integer, first name, which is a string, that's nullable, a middle initial, etc. So it tells us everything we are looking for. So from a software standpoint or an automation standpoint, a computer can read this and build out a user interface for it. Show you an example of that. You click on one of the boxes here, like I clicked on contact/contact UI, and it says, okay, we got a parameter here called ID. Give me an ID. I'm going to put in 1. Let's try it out. I'm going to type in the number 1 and do execute. And when I tried it out the first time, it didn't have anything in there, so it returned back nothing. So if I do execute, it went out. It's showing you the command that actually could run. So you can run this command from the command line. Then or you can go and call this. So if I ran this command or this URL in a new browser window, I would get the same result. So if I look at the user interface, it gets back the result of the call, which in this case is, let's zoom in. Actually, let's just make this a little bit bigger so we can see it. And I'll zoom back out. This returns the same thing that this returns, just in a different colored format and any headers that were there. I can go and change it to say I'm posting text JSON or application JSON. In this case, we're not doing anything. I can also go and just do a get contacts to execute all contacts. So similar to the tool I was using within JetBrains Writer, you can execute it here, but in this case, anyone can do it. Even a non quote unquote engineer can do it. I can say, oh, let me see what's happening. Let me test an API with a contact of 1234, which doesn't exist. Let's see what happens. So this provides a really nice, easy way for users and engineers to expose their API and let others know what they want. Best thing about it is it's using the OpenApi spec, which is everything that this JSON file talks about, or at least describes. Let's go and see how we can make our example look a little bit more like this example, with more details about it. Put this text here, uploads an image, adds paper stores, etc. Or sorry, adds pet stores. So for the most part, a lot of this is generated based on code comments. You notice I didn't put a lot of code comments in our documentation because I wanted us to go here and start looking at it. And let's see if they have it here. Here it is. Describing parameters. This is our first step in describing the ID and everything. This goes through the entire spec for doing it, but doesn't really show you how to do it within our code base. So let's go and take a look at how we do that. Let's first see if there's the example here. Here it tells us that we have a simple example ASP.NET Core Web API. And this is one of the steps to do it. So we have to enable what's called the XML comments. So let's go about doing that. And I think we do that by going to our Explorer, and it wants the CS proj, which we haven't looked at before. Let's do edit. And what was the text we needed to add? Generate documentation. So what this does is this is going to take any of the XML comments we have and spit out a file with those comments in it. Right now, we don't have anything declared, so it would just spit out an empty file. Not worried about that right now. So we need to do this to set the right directory for those files, which was inside the add swagger to it. So let's go back to the add swagger, which should be here, and say, let's do that. I need to import some missing references. This line here is telling us the file name is going to be by default your executing assembly, which here would be context.api.dll, and then append the .xml to the end of it. And then this is the fully combined path, so where everything gets created. And then we're telling Swagger to use that XML file. I believe that's all we actually have to do. So let's start going and adding some of the text. So let's start with the API itself. And where did I go? The contacts controller. So here we are going to add some documentation. We can probably get rid of that since we know it's there. I kept this in for references while we were building out this. But double lines are not really required, or double lines are just comments. So here we are going to add an XML comment. So as soon as I do 3 triple forward slashes, or sorry, not 3 triple, 3 forward slashes, we get the IntelliSense here that generates the summary for. So here we put a summary of what you want. We can put in whatever we want. The contacts, endpoints, provide the edit, provide the functionality to maintain our contacts. Now you can put whatever you want in here. This is just an example. Now let's just take a look at the first method, then we'll come back and add the others. So here we were going to say this adds a, or sorry, search, not search, list all of the contacts currently available. Then you'll notice it added a returns here. The returns is what is going to come back. Typically, you would put something like a contact with its associated data or whatever makes sense for you. We can do something like link to the models to say something to the effect of cref domain, what do we call it? Contacts dot domain dot. Oh, that package is not referenced here. Dot contact. Context that's equal to multiple choices. So here it's going to provide a link for it. So if I save this, restart our web browser, or restart the web server, come back to our documentation, this really hasn't changed. So if I refresh our page here, you'll see now we have a list of all contacts currently available, which is the text that I sent. Nothing on the root of contacts unless I open it up. Nope. I don't know why that's not showing. We'll figure that part out in a second. If I open up the get contacts, there are no parameters, so nothing is listed there. And then there should be a return. Why didn't I see the return? I don't know why the returns didn't list. Oh well. figure that part out too. So let's go and do that. Let's figure those out. Let's stop the web service for now. This one's going to be a little bit different because there's a parameter to it. The identifier of the contact. Now you can call this whatever you want. If you want to use the terms of the database, the primary key, you can say the primary identifier. This is however you want to write the documentation. Gets a specific contact from the contact manager. And then this should actually be a list of contacts. And then here it's just a cref contact. Now if I save and rerun it, let's hit refresh on the UI. Our contact has I get a specific contact. If I open it up, I get the text that says the help text with it, as long as a message here that gives me something to do. So if I type in 0, obviously that all disappears. If I type in 1 and choose execute, we have everything that there is relating to this contact. And that's pretty much how we add it. Most of it is going to come from this documentation here, these XML comments. You can also do smarter annotations. This one already serves as an integer, so we really don't need to do anything else from there, but I could do something and strap constraints around this to say this needs to be a number higher than 0 to add some additional flavor to it. So let's take a look, see if our documentation here listed out requires data type. Oh look, you got a sample request. Oh, this is something I didn't return in here, but instructions as to what the HTTP status codes would be. So we can go and take care of that. And then this is going to whether or not the parameters are required. So if we looked at our UI and went down here to look at our contacts, it's saying that everything is nullable when actually we know it's not nullable. So we can go and be smart about it and add that attribute to the domain model, add this required attribute to tell it it's required. And then the user interfaces will be smart enough to say, hey, you can't go and query on this because you need to give me something for it. It's also a way to give us a range. So I can go to our domain here and under the models, let's go to contact, and I can put in the required attribute for this. If I spelled required right. And I don't need the word attribute. Oh, I don't have the data annotations reference in here, so let me go and add that, which is this namespace. And new line using. And we don't know where that is because I don't have it. So let's do a quick search for NuGet, and there it is, system component model annotations. I should be able to add this to the project. And now our annotations are there, and this is required. We're going to make this field required also. And then I believe there's annotations around the formatting of, yes, we can say that this is an email address. It already knows this is a date of birth. We can set this to be required to. Now our code is going to look a lot different. Oh, let's add one more. For here, this is not required, but this should be a URL. So now if we republish this, stop and rerun, let's refresh this in the background. Let's look at the contact. Now you notice here that the first name has a red asterisk on it, meaning it's required. It's no longer showing the nullable equals true. Our image URL is telling us that we are expecting a string that is of type URL and an email address that is, or sorry, a string that is of type email. So if we were to call the post method and do something like try it out, it's giving us a sample because it knows what it should look like. It's telling me a string, username, and URL. This tool itself is not necessarily smart enough to give you the UI for it to say, you know, all the validation, but it's a good helping point to do it. So if I went and put in something that wasn't a URL for this and try to submit it, should fail. Showing me what it's going to run, and it's given me a one or more validation fails. So the web API, before it even got to our code, said, hey, the image URL is not a fully qualified path because we added the URL attribute, and the email address is not a fully validated email address. So before it even got to, where's our controller? Before it even got to our post method here and did any of the validation, it stopped. The web server said, hey, you don't have everything I need to even handle this request, because we went and added these model validations on it. So IIS/web server was smart enough to say no. And there were a bunch of other things you can do as far as validation. There are a lot of out-of-the-box ones. If you look at the system component model.data annotations, you can see a lot. There's also a bunch of open source ones that do things like regular expressions, credit card validations, phone numbers, postal codes, etc. Let's see what else. We can describe responses. DocuWise presentation should represent a banner theme. Yeah, we're not going to worry about that. As if we want to change and update the user interface, we're going to keep the colors fine. And you don't only have to use Swashbuckle. Swashbuckle is just one of the tools that you can use. You can also use NSWAG, which is another open source. And the setup is very similar. So find the one you need and find the one that works for you in order to do this. And these are just suggestions. You don't have to go and do it, but it makes it a lot cleaner to have a user interface like this that you can talk to or you can share with your users. And I'm not going to bore you with going through each of these. I'll go through and clean them up and add in more contextual text and some validations behind the scenes, and then publish this to GitHub later on. That's all I had for the adding documentation. If there are any questions, feel free to reach out in the chat or hit me up on any one of the social media channels listed here. Cool. Thanks for joining. Have a great day.